Texas, August 1944. The sun beats down on the parched soil of central Texas. Cicadas drone in the heat. Dust swirls along the dirt road leading to a fenced compound. Rows of barracks, towers, and barbed wire shimmering under the noon light. Inside, a group of women in faded Luftwaffe uniforms work quietly in the cotton fields. Their movements are measured, almost mechanical. The war that tore their homeland apart feels distant here, yet its shadow lingers on every face. A U.S. Army truck rattles toward them, kicking up a trail of dust. The guards tense slightly, but the truck slows and stops near the fence. From the back step down local farmers, sunburned men in straw hats, women holding baskets of food. For a moment, everything freezes. The German prisoners exchange wary glances. The Americans stand silent. Then one of the farmers steps forward, voice soft but steady. "Dinner?" he says, gesturing beyond the gate. "You're welcome to join us." A murmur ripples through the POWs. Disbelief, confusion, even fear. These were their enemies. Yet here, in the heart of Texas, they were being invited to share a meal. The war had taken them across oceans, but humanity had followed. By mid-1943, the tide of World War II had turned. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was bleeding on every front. The Eastern Front had devoured entire German armies. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps, battered and exhausted, surrendered in Tunisia. Across the Atlantic, the United States had shifted from isolation to industrial fury, producing tanks, ships, and aircraft faster than any nation in history. Millions of men were locked in battle, but behind them stood millions more, the unseen workforce that kept the war alive. In Germany, women filled the gaps left by conscripted men. They worked in munitions plants, hospitals, and communications, many wearing the gray-blue uniform of the Luftwaffe Helferinnen, female auxiliaries serving as clerks, radio operators, and anti-aircraft support. When Allied forces advanced across Europe and North Africa, thousands of these women were captured. Though non-combatants by strict definition, they were part of Hitler's war machine, and thus classified as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. But Europe was bursting with captives. By 1943, the Allies faced a logistical nightmare. Over 350,000 Axis prisoners crowded temporary camps in North Africa and Italy. Space, food, and security became overwhelming concerns. The U.S. government proposed a solution that shocked even some of its allies: bring the prisoners to America. It was an audacious plan. The Atlantic was still stalked by German U-boats, and transporting tens of thousands of enemy personnel across it carried immense risk. But the U.S. had ships, ports, and a vast interior, isolated, secure, and underpopulated. By late 1943, the first convoys of captured Germans began arriving on American shores. They disembarked at ports in New York, Virginia, and Louisiana under heavy guard. Then, by train, they were scattered across the country, from California to the Carolinas, from the pine forests of Arkansas to the endless plains of Texas. Texas alone would become home to over 65,000 German POWs, the largest concentration in the United States. Dozens of camps sprang up almost overnight: Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Huntsville, Camp Mexia, and smaller satellite compounds near rural towns. Each was surrounded by high fences, manned towers, and guarded gates, yet many were built with an almost surreal calmness. For local Texans, the sight of German uniforms in their countryside was jarring. Newspaper headlines warned of Hitler's soldiers in our backyard. But the reality was less dramatic. The camps were efficiently organized, strictly governed by the 1929 Geneva Convention, and the prisoners, most of them weary, disillusioned, and far from home, caused little trouble. Among them were not only hardened soldiers from the Africa Corps or U-boat crews, but also small contingents of women, nurses, secretaries, communication aides, and civilian auxiliaries captured in Italy or France. Their presence was unusual. Female POWs were rare. But the U.S., determined to maintain its moral and legal standing, treated them under the same protections as their male counterparts. When they arrived, Texas must have felt like another planet. The horizon stretched endlessly. The air was heavy with dust and heat. The war that had consumed their lives in Europe, air raids, hunger, propaganda, rubble, was replaced by the hum of insects and the scent of freshly plowed earth. For these German women, captivity in America was disorienting, but it was also unexpectedly peaceful. Here, there were no bombs, no Gestapo, no Allied aircraft screaming overhead, just barbed wire, boredom, and the haunting question that lingered in every captive's mind. What happens now? And beyond those fences, in the towns and farms of Texas, Americans faced a question of their own. With their sons overseas, crops unharvested, and labor scarce, could they set aside hatred long enough to let the enemy help them? That quiet question would soon bring two worlds together, across a fence, across a meal, across the invisible line between war and humanity. The camps that dotted Texas were unlike any prison Europe had known. Built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they rose quickly on old fairgrounds, cotton fields, and ranch land. Each was a miniature city, a grid of barracks, kitchens, infirmaries, workshops, and parade grounds. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the fences were more symbolic than desperate. Most prisoners had no wish to escape. The Atlantic was too far, and the war, they sensed, was already lost. Every camp followed the Geneva Convention's detailed code. Rations equal to those of American soldiers, medical care by U.S. Army doctors, opportunities for religious practice, and protection from humiliation or forced labor. Prisoners addressed guards as Sir. Guards, in turn, were instructed to show discipline and restraint. For many Americans, it was shocking. Newspaper editorials protested, claiming the prisoners were living better than our own poor. But Washington held firm. The War Department argued that humane treatment was not charity. It was strategy. American captives in German hands would be treated according to the example the U.S. set. By 1944, Texas alone hosted over 20 full-scale POW camps and more than 36 branch camps attached to them. Camp Hearn, near Bryan, became so well run it earned the nickname the best little POW camp in Texas. Inside, prisoners formed orchestras, printed newsletters, and even staged theatrical plays. They built furniture, carved figurines, painted murals. For many, it was a surreal existence. Enemy soldiers living almost peacefully inside the nation they had been taught to destroy. But it was the work that brought them closest to America. The U.S. faced a massive labor shortage. With millions of young men overseas, farms and factories struggled to survive. The government authorized POW labor under supervision, paying each prisoner a small credit that could be spent in the camp canteen. German men harvested cotton, built irrigation ditches, and picked fruit across the South. The women, fewer in number, mostly Luftwaffe auxiliaries and medical staff, were assigned to lighter agricultural work, sorting produce, tending poultry, sewing uniforms, or assisting in canneries. In the beginning, Texans watched them from a distance. There was fear and a little anger. Many had lost sons in Europe. To see the enemy now helping on their land felt almost insulting. But in the small rural communities that surrounded camps like Mexia, Hearn, and Brady, necessity overcame resentment. Farmers needed help, and the POWs, under guard but polite, efficient, and often grateful for the work, provided it. Days began to follow a steady rhythm. Trucks rolled out at dawn, carrying prisoners and guards to local farms. Work under the Texan sun was grueling, but the women were used to hardship. Some sang softly in German as they worked. Others labored in silence. The American farmers noticed their precision, their pride in doing things properly, even as captives. Then came the first gestures, a jug of cool water offered during the break, a loaf of bread shared under the shade of a pecan tree. A cautious smile returned. The guards, often local reservists or men too old for the front, noticed the change but didn't stop it. They saw no harm in small kindnesses. For the German women, each gesture cut through months of propaganda that had painted Americans as monsters. For the Texans, it was disarming. These Nazis were simply young women, sunburned, hungry, and far from home. Inside the camps, word spread quickly about which farmers were kind and which were not. Some allowed the women to rest in barns during the heat. Others brought homemade pies or lemonade. Strictly speaking, such generosity bent the rules. Fraternization with POWs was forbidden. But in small-town Texas, rules sometimes yielded to decency. The war still raged across the oceans, yet here, something entirely different was happening. The barbed wire was beginning to lose its meaning. And one summer Sunday, in a quiet farming community not far from Camp Mexia, that invisible line between captor and captive would dissolve completely. When a group of local farmers decided to do something unthinkable, they invited the German women prisoners to dinner. War dehumanizes long before it kills. For years, both Germans and Americans had been taught to fear and hate one another. In Nazi Germany, propaganda films portrayed the United States as a decadent land of greed and racial decay. In America, Germans were shown as fanatical followers of Hitler, marching in lockstep to tyranny. But when the war brought them face to face under the blinding Texas sun, those images began to crack. The German women who arrived at camps like Mexia, Herne, and Huntsville were mostly in their early 20s. Many had joined the Luftwaffe auxiliary service out of duty, not ideology, daughters of farmers, teachers, and clerks swept into Hitler's machine. Some had seen the collapse of Italy, the bombing of Hamburg, or the retreat from France. Others had never been near the front lines until their capture. They carried themselves with the disciplined reserve drilled into them by the Reich, but inside, many were simply exhausted. In letters and diaries preserved after the war, some wrote of disbelief upon seeing America. One recalled, "We expected harshness. Instead, they smiled. It was confusing. We were the enemy." For the Texans, the feeling was equally complicated. They had watched their sons, brothers, and husbands leave for battle. Many had received telegrams that never should have been opened. To them, Germans were responsible for the heartbreak hanging in every farmhouse. Yet now here they were, young women who looked, spoke, and acted not unlike their own daughters. That recognition, that unsettling familiarity, became the beginning of something rare in wartime: empathy. Life in the Texas camps blurred the line between punishment and refuge. The German women were prisoners, but they were also witnesses to a version of America they had never imagined. They saw guards reading newspapers freely, churches welcoming anyone, children laughing without fear of sirens. They began to realize that the world outside Nazi propaganda was larger, freer, and stranger than they had been told. One POW later described her moment of clarity. They did not fear their government. They spoke openly. They joked. It was as if the air itself was lighter here. To many of them, that freedom was more shocking than captivity itself. And to the Texans, The humanity of their prisoners posed quiet moral questions. Could you still hate someone once you had shared water with them? Once you had seen the sunburn on their neck, the tremor in their hands, the homesickness in their eyes? The guards often found themselves in quiet conflict with their own orders. They had been told to enforce discipline, to maintain distance. But in a small camp, with the same faces every day, distance slowly dissolved. Some would sneak an extra apple into a lunch bag, or look the other way when a POW lingered to talk with a farm girl in the shade of a truck. These gestures didn't make headlines. They weren't acts of defiance, just small acknowledgments of shared humanity. Texas was its own kind of world, proud, traditional, rooted in family and faith. Hospitality wasn't just a courtesy, it was identity. Yet extending that hospitality to enemy prisoners tested the very meaning of it. At first, there was suspicion. Locals whispered that some POWs were spies, that fraternization could endanger the war effort. But as months passed, fear gave way to curiosity. People began to notice that the German women prayed before meals, sang hymns in the evenings, and wrote letters home that sounded not so different from their own. In many ways, they shared values: work, faith, dignity, and discipline. Texans admired hard workers, and the German women were exactly that. Even when the guards weren't watching, they worked with a quiet determination. The farmers saw it and respected it. One farmer later recalled, "They did not ask for pity. They wanted to do their part. That meant something." And so, slowly, the distance closed. What began as wary cooperation turned into an unspoken friendship, one built not on politics or belief, but on shared survival in the heat of a Texas summer. When a farmer's wife offered a slice of pie or lemonade, the POWs would hesitate, unsure if it was a trick, a test. But the kindness was real. A few began to speak in broken English, exchanging words, smiles, even laughter. For the first time, some Texans found themselves wondering what it meant to be the enemy. The cultural exchange ran deeper than anyone expected. Americans discovered that not every German was a Nazi zealot. Germans discovered that not every American was a decadent aggressor. It was, in its quiet way, the beginning of reconciliation, years before the war had even ended. The fence still stood, but its meaning had changed. And soon, that fragile trust would be tested, not by war, but by a simple act of hospitality that would cross the last forbidden line: sharing a meal. To the casual observer, the American treatment of German prisoners, especially in Texas, might seem naive. Why feed and clothe the enemy? Why allow them dignity while Americans died on foreign soil? But to Washington and the War Department, it was not mercy for mercy's sake. It was a calculated extension of policy, a weapon of moral superiority. From the very beginning of the POW program, the United States Army Service Forces emphasized that every prisoner, regardless of rank or gender, would be treated according to the Geneva Convention of 1929. This was not merely international law, it was a declaration of principle. The logic was twofold. First, humane treatment of Axis prisoners would protect American soldiers held in German camps, a mirror of behavior across the Atlantic. Second, and more subtly, it would demonstrate to the world, and eventually to the German people, that America fought not for conquest, but for civilization itself. Behind the scenes, American intelligence saw the POW camps as psychological laboratories. Each camp was a controlled environment where propaganda, discipline, and moral influence could be quietly tested. While combat raged in Europe, the Office of War Information, OWI, and the War Department's Special Projects Division observed the behavior of German prisoners in the U.S. They studied how exposure to freedom, fairness, and democracy affected their beliefs. Many of these reports, later declassified, concluded that humane treatment, more than any leaflet or broadcast, had the most powerful impact on post-war re-education. Inside the camps, newspapers written by POWs were subtly monitored. Camp libraries offered both German classics and translated American literature. Movies were screened, sometimes Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, sometimes simple comedies that showed American life as ordinary, prosperous, and free. The idea was simple: show them the difference. In Texas, that difference was amplified by geography itself: the open plains, the lack of fences beyond the camp, the sight of families living without fear. These were things many German women had never known. For a society raised under dictatorship, where every word and action carried the weight of surveillance, America's casual openness was revolutionary. The U.S. government understood the long game. The war would end, but the peace would depend on minds that could either rebuild or relapse into extremism. So, while Allied armies fought for territory, America quietly fought for perception. There was also a deeper, less pragmatic layer: the conscience of ordinary people. Many of the guards, farmers, and townsfolk who interacted with POWs were not soldiers hardened by combat. They were civilians, teachers, ranchers, storekeepers, suddenly drawn into the machinery of war. They understood loss, but they also understood decency. Some saw the POWs as young men and women misled by propaganda, not monsters. Others acted out of faith, believing that the Christian duty to treat one's neighbor kindly did not end at the enemy line. Churches near the camps often sent pastors to hold services for the prisoners, providing Bibles in German. When asked why, one minister in Waco simply said, "Because the war will end, but our souls will not." It wasn't universal. Not everyone approved. Letters to local newspapers accused the government of coddling Nazis, wasting taxpayer money, or betraying fallen soldiers. Yet time and again, the stories that filtered out of Texas told a different truth: of compassion quietly undermining hate. To the German women, that kindness struck deeper than any interrogation could. It wasn't propaganda, it was lived reality. They saw guards share cigarettes, farmers offer meals, and local women bring clothing for cold nights. It created a moral dissonance. How could these be the barbaric Americans we were warned about? Post-war testimonies from German POWs, both male and female, reveal how profoundly these experiences affected them. One Luftwaffe nurse, held in Texas until 1946, later told interviewers, "I learned that democracy is not weakness. It is strength without cruelty." Another recalled, "In Germany, we were told the Americans would treat us like animals. But in Texas, they treated us as humans. That broke something inside, something dark." Such statements were quietly celebrated in Washington. They hinted at something revolutionary: the possibility of defeating Nazism not just by arms, but by example. In hindsight, the Texas camps became an early experiment in what would later be called hearts and minds warfare. No slogans, no coercion, just the quiet power of decency. And that decency reached its most vivid expression in one of the most unlikely moments of the war, when a group of American farmers asked permission to invite the German women they worked with to Sunday dinner. For the War Department, it was a breach of protocol. For history, it became a symbol. That simple meal, bread, meat, laughter, and silence shared between enemies, would become the turning point in how captivity, compassion, and reconciliation intertwined on American soil. The day of that dinner began like any other: a convoy leaving the camp gates, the heat rising over the fields, and the faint hum of life inside a country at war. But by sunset, nothing about those prisoners, or their captors, would ever feel the same again. It was late summer, 1944. The war in Europe raged with unspeakable ferocity. Cities burned, armies collapsed, and families scattered. But here, in the quiet farmland of central Texas, time seemed to move differently. At Camp Mexia, about 100 miles south of Dallas, a group of German women POWs had spent weeks working on nearby cotton and corn farms. They left the camp each morning under guard, riding in flatbed trucks, and returned at dusk, tired, sunburned, and silent. For most, the monotony of labor was a relief compared to the fear and chaos they had left behind. That morning had been like any other. The trucks rattled down the dirt road, the women clutching their work gloves and water tins. The farmers were waiting, as usual, by the edge of the field. But something about the atmosphere was different. Lighter, almost festive. A guard later recalled, "I remember thinking it felt like a Sunday. Too quiet, too calm." The day's work passed easily. By afternoon, the farmers were setting aside their tools, gathering under the shade of a wide oak. The women followed, expecting to be counted and loaded back onto the trucks. Instead, one of the farmers, a middle-aged man named Walter Reed, whose sons were fighting in France, stepped forward. His wife, Evelyn, stood beside him, holding a basket covered with a white cloth. Walter looked toward the sergeant in charge and said quietly, "We'd like to have them join us for dinner." The sergeant hesitated. It wasn't exactly against the rules, but it wasn't allowed either. The War Department's manual discouraged any personal interaction with prisoners beyond work supervision. Yet this was Texas, far from Washington. Out here, people often did what felt right, rather than what was written. After a long pause, the sergeant nodded. "Keep it short and keep it decent." And with that, the gates of captivity opened, if only for an evening. A long wooden table was set up under the oak tree, patched together from old planks and barrels. The farmers' wives brought out cornbread, roasted chicken, potatoes, and pitchers of sweet tea. The smell drifted across the field, mingling with the dust and sun. At first, the German women stood apart, unsure what to do. Their instincts, years of discipline and fear, told them it was a test. In Germany, kindness from an enemy could mean humiliation. But then Evelyn smiled and gestured gently to the benches. "Bitte, sitzen Sie," she said in broken German. "Please, sit." Slowly, awkwardly, they obeyed. What followed was one of those moments history rarely records. Quiet, fragile, profoundly human. No speeches, no politics. Just people, once divided by war, now passing dishes and exchanging hesitant smiles. A guard would later write in his journal, "They ate like they didn't trust their own hands, like the food might disappear if they believed it." Conversation began in fragments. The farmers spoke simple English. The POWs answered with a mix of words and gestures. Laughter, at first nervous, began to rise. One of the German women, a 23-year-old radio operator from Hamburg, hummed a folk tune. An American farmer's daughter, a teenager in a gingham dress, recognized the melody and joined in softly. For a moment, even the guards forgot which side they were on. Across that table, worlds collided and then quietly intertwined. For the German women, it was a disorienting glimpse into the enemy's soul. They had expected arrogance or revenge, but found warmth instead. One of them, later interviewed by a historian, recalled, "They did not look at us as monsters. They looked at us as people. That was harder to bear than hatred." For the Texans, the shock ran deeper. Here were women whose homeland had sent bombs and submarines against their sons. And yet, when they spoke not of Hitler or glory, but of homes, families, and lost brothers. It was impossible not to see themselves reflected back. Evening settled slowly over the fields. The light turned amber, then gold. The farmers poured coffee. The guards leaned on their rifles but said nothing. In that stillness, something extraordinary happened. The war, for a brief and impossible moment, seemed to vanish. When it was time to return to camp, the German women stood and thanked their hosts. Some bowed slightly, others wiped tears from their eyes. Evelyn handed them the leftover bread and said, "You'll need this tomorrow." They climbed back onto the trucks, the sound of the engine breaking the silence. As they drove away, the farmers waved. The women waved back. No one spoke for the rest of the ride. One guard later said, "That was the quietest I ever heard them, like something sacred had happened." Back inside the barbed wire, word spread fast. Some guards worried they had gone too far. Reports were written, but never pursued. The commanding officer at Camp Mexia noted only that local civilians have demonstrated goodwill toward female POW laborers. But among the prisoners, the event became legend, retold in letters, whispered across bunks, remembered long after repatriation. It wasn't the meal itself that mattered. It was what it revealed, that the walls between enemies could bend, that hatred was not inevitable, and that even in war, kindness could be its own quiet rebellion. The story didn't end there. What happened under that oak tree in Texas would echo far beyond those fields, inspiring similar gestures across other camps, changing how America saw its prisoners, and how many prisoners came to see America. What happened at that quiet farm near Camp Mexia was not reported in the newspapers. There were no photographs, no official records, no proclamations. It began and ended in silence, a dinner that lasted less than 2 hours. Yet in its stillness, it spoke louder than any broadcast of the time. Within weeks, similar gestures began surfacing at other camps. At Camp Hearn, guards noticed that local families started sending baskets of food to the work detachments. In Camp Swift, a group of churchwomen left fresh bread and fruit for German nurses assigned to a nearby hospital. At Camp Brady, one farmer, moved by the dinner story he'd heard from a relative, hosted a Christmas picnic for 12 female prisoners. None of it was official. None of it was organized. It was a quiet contagion of empathy. For the guards, mostly National Guard reservists and veterans too old for frontline duty, the sudden thaw was both inspiring and unsettling. They had been trained to maintain order, to enforce the invisible line between us and them. But in the daily rhythm of farm work and evening roll, calls, that line had already begun to blur. After the dinners began, reports trickled up the chain of command. Some officers feared that such fraternization might lead to security breaches or even escape attempts, yet none came. The German women did not exploit the kindness. On the contrary, their behavior became even more disciplined, their cooperation more sincere. One camp commander later noted in his log, "Discipline improves with trust. The women work willingly and show gratitude." Washington took notice, not to punish, but to study. The War Department's Special Projects Division, which monitored morale and behavior among POWs, quietly documented the Texas incidents. Their conclusion was unexpected. Small acts of kindness increased obedience, reduced hostility, and produced what they called voluntary ideological moderation. In the towns surrounding the camps, opinion divided. Some locals saw the dinners as an act of simple decency. Others, especially those with sons in combat, felt betrayed. Letters appeared in regional newspapers condemning sentimentality toward Hitler's women. But there were also letters of defense. One signed only "A Texas Mother," who wrote, "If my boy were captured overseas, I would pray that someone, somewhere, would offer him a seat at their table." Gradually, hostility softened. The war was entering its final, grueling year, and Americans were tired. Tired of casualty lists, tired of hatred, tired of fear. The sight of once feared enemies working, singing, even smiling in their fields offered a strange comfort, a glimpse of peace before peace existed. The ripples reached farther than anyone imagined. Word of the humane treatment of POWs in the United States, particularly of the women, traveled through Red Cross channels and even into neutral press. In Switzerland, humanitarian observers noted that the American system of prisoner integration represents a remarkable contrast to European camps. Captured Allied soldiers in German hands also benefited indirectly. The Geneva Convention worked only by reciprocity. Every act of American fairness gave leverage to diplomats pressing Berlin for equal treatment. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in war ever is. But thousands of Allied prisoners later testified that they were spared brutality because their captors feared retaliation for mistreating Germans held in America. In that sense, the dinner in Texas wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It was a link in a vast moral chain connecting unseen lives across oceans. For the German women, the emotional impact was profound. They began to write letters home, carefully censored but filled with subtle hints. We are treated well. The people are kind. Some spoke of their disbelief, others of gratitude. Years later, historians studying their post-war lives noticed a pattern. Many of those women, upon returning to Germany, became teachers, nurses, and community organizers. Some joined early movements promoting reconciliation and democracy in the new West Germany. One former POW from Camp Hearn later told an interviewer, "It was in Texas that I first understood what freedom feels like. Not what it says, but what it feels like." These were small individual awakenings, yet together they formed a part of the foundation for a post-war generation determined to rebuild differently from their parents. Meanwhile, the farmers who had shared their tables with the POWs carried their own transformation. When the war ended and victory was declared, there was jubilation, but also reflection. Many Texans admitted privately that they no longer saw all Germans as the enemy. Some even wrote letters of recommendation for the women when repatriation began, attesting to their good conduct and honesty. A few friendships endured through letters long after the war. Packages crossed the Atlantic. Texas pecans sent to ruined towns in Bavaria. Embroidered handkerchiefs sent back in return. It was the smallest kind of peace, yet perhaps the most genuine. In retrospect, historians would call these moments micro-acts of reconciliation. They did not shorten the war or change the battlefield, but they changed people. And people, in the end, are what history is made of. The Texas dinners became quiet symbols of what the Allied victory claimed to stand for. Not vengeance, but values. When the Nuremberg trials later exposed the full horror of the Reich, the memory of such kindnesses made the contrast even starker, proving that justice could be firm without cruelty, that victory could coexist with humanity. By 1945, when the war finally collapsed into silence, thousands of German POWs in America, including the women of Camp Mexia, began their long journey home. They left behind not just the fences and fields, but an idea that even in the deepest conflict, decency can survive as resistance of its own kind. The fields of Texas would soon fall quiet again. But for those who had sat together beneath the oak that summer, the war had already changed shape. From a struggle of armies to a question that would linger for decades. What does it mean to treat your enemy as human? By the spring of 1945, the war that had swallowed the world was collapsing under its own weight. Hitler was dead. Berlin lay in ruins. The Reich, once imagined as eternal, had burned itself to ash. In Texas, the news came by radio. POWs gathered in silence around the loudspeakers that hung in the camp squares. Some wept openly. Others stood rigid, unable to process what the defeat meant. For years they had been told they were fighting for destiny. Now, destiny had dissolved into surrender. The American officers at the camps were cautious. They ordered extra patrols, fearing riots or suicides. But the German women at Camp Mexia reacted differently. There were tears, yes, but also relief. The fear that the war might never end was gone. The waiting could finally stop. The guards noticed a strange stillness over the camp in those final days. Work detachments were suspended. The canteens were closed. The women, once brisk and efficient, now sat quietly in groups, mending clothes, writing letters they knew might never reach anyone. Then came the official notice: repatriation. The War Department began processing the return of prisoners under Allied control. It was a massive logistical operation. Ships crossing the Atlantic filled not with troops, but with those who had once been their captives. At Camp Mexia, the news brought mixed emotions. Many of the women had lived there for nearly 2 years. They had planted flowers by their barracks, painted murals of alpine landscapes on wooden walls, and carved small mementos from scrap wood. The camp, for all its barbed wire, had become a kind of fragile home. As preparations began, something unexpected happened. The farmers, those same men and women who had shared their Sunday dinners months before, came to the gates one last time. Some brought small gifts, Bibles with English inscriptions, jars of homemade preserves, photographs of their families. One farmer's wife, who had hosted the first dinner, handed a young German nurse a folded checkered apron. "You'll need it," she said softly. "Where you're going, you'll be cooking again soon." The guards allowed the exchanges, turning discreetly away. They understood what it meant to say goodbye. The women were taken by truck convoys to Camp Shanks, New York, the final staging point for Europe-bound prisoners. From there, Liberty ships carried them across the Atlantic, through the same waters where U-boats had once hunted them. The voyage home was quiet. They watched the endless gray sea, thinking of the lives they were returning to. Some had no homes left, no families to greet them. Others feared Soviet occupation in the East, where former Wehrmacht members, even auxiliaries, were often treated as traitors. When they finally landed in Bremerhaven, they stepped into a landscape of devastation. Cities flattened, food scarce, millions displaced. The women from Texas were shocked. The country they had left behind in 1943 was gone. In the Allied processing zones, they were questioned, screened, and released into a nation that no longer recognized itself. Yet many carried something invisible back from America, a small reservoir of faith and decency, a memory of being treated not as monsters, but as people. A former POW later wrote in a letter to a Texas family, "When everything around us was rubble, I remembered your kindness. It helped me believe that not all was lost." In Texas, life resumed its old rhythm. The camps emptied, the fences came down, and the farmland returned to silence. But the locals did not forget. Years later, when veterans and civilians were interviewed about the POW years, many recalled those months with quiet pride. Some called them the most peaceful part of the war. Old farmers would point to the fields where the Germans once worked and say, "Right there, under that tree, we had them over for dinner." To the next generation, it sounded almost unbelievable. But for those who had lived it, it was simple truth. And in 1946, a letter arrived from Germany, addressed to one of the families near Mexia. Inside was a photograph of a rebuilt kitchen and a note written in careful English. "Your dinner taught me forgiveness. You shared bread when the world was starving for mercy." The war was over, but its echoes, carried in letters, memories, and a few small wooden carvings, would linger long after the uniforms were folded away. And as peace slowly returned, another kind of reckoning began, not of victory or defeat, but of meaning. By 1946, the vast network of POW camps that had once dotted America's landscape was vanishing. The barbed wire came down, guard towers were dismantled, and the barracks were sold or repurposed as storage sheds, churches, even classrooms. Yet their true legacy was invisible, carried home in the minds of those who had once been confined there. Among them were the German women prisoners of Texas. They had entered the camps as soldiers or auxiliaries of a totalitarian empire and left as witnesses to something rare, the humanity of their enemy. Historians later traced how many of them became quiet agents of Germany's democratic rebirth. Some joined social organizations that taught civics and humanitarian law in the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany. Others worked with the Red Cross, the Lutheran Aid Society, and emerging women's associations, drawing directly from the discipline and fairness they had seen in the American camps. Their letters and testimonies became early evidence for a simple but revolutionary idea: that dignity, even in captivity, could change minds more deeply than any propaganda leaflet ever could. For the United States, the Texas experience became an unexpected diplomatic tool. Reports compiled by the War Department's Prisoner of War Division were circulated in Washington, London, and Geneva. They emphasized how humane treatment of Axis prisoners had strengthened America's moral authority during the final years of the war. When occupation forces later entered Germany, those reports influenced policy. Rather than repeating the harsh collective punishments of 1919, U.S. planners under General Lucius D. Clay sought to balance justice with reconstruction. They had seen, through Texas, that mercy was not weakness, it was strategy. Former POWs who had been treated humanely were more likely to cooperate, to reject extremism, and to rebuild without resentment. This psychological insight would later feed into the broader Marshall Plan, the cornerstone of post-war European recovery. The seeds of reconciliation had been planted not in Paris or Berlin, but in the farmlands of America, in places like Mexia, Hearne, and Brady, where farmers once invited their captives to Sunday dinner. For decades, the story of the German women POWs in Texas remained obscure, hidden beneath the larger narratives of D-Day, the Holocaust, and atomic warfare. It resurfaced only through scattered memoirs, oral histories, and local archives, fragments of a quieter war. In one such account, a Texan farmer's granddaughter recalled, "My grandmother said she looked into those girls' eyes and saw her own reflection. Tired, scared, just trying to survive. That was the day she stopped hating." By the 1980s, historians began to revisit these forgotten encounters. The Texas Historical Commission restored parts of Camp Hearne as an educational site, displaying artifacts made by the prisoners, carvings, paintings, handcrafted tools. Many pieces bore the initials of their makers, small signatures of people once reduced to numbers. Visitors were struck not by tales of escape or violence, but by the quiet evidence of coexistence, a shared humanity preserved within the framework of war. In Germany, a few of the women who had been imprisoned in Texas lived long enough to see their grandchildren visit America. Some even returned to Texas decades later, seeking the towns where they had labored, the families who had shown them kindness. One such returnee, interviewed by a local newspaper in 1992, stood in front of the now silent field where she had once picked cotton. She said softly, "We came as enemies. We left as human beings." That line, simple yet profound, has since been quoted in several documentaries and academic works. It encapsulates what the Texas camps came to represent: not perfection, not utopia, but the possibility of moral clarity amid destruction. Today, few physical traces of those camps remain. Grass has reclaimed the fields. The wind that once carried commands in English and German now moves only through open air. but in both nations' memories, the story endures, as a lesson carved not in monuments, but in conduct. When later wars would test humanity again, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, military ethicists would look back to World War II's POW experience as a benchmark. And among the examples they cited, the Texas camps stood out, not for their victories, but for their restraint. For history's harshest conflict, that restraint became its quiet redemption. The war had torn the world apart. But in the heart of Texas, among strangers who chose to share a meal instead of malice, it had also proven something else. That compassion can survive even when civilization nearly doesn't. The story could have ended there, with the ships departing, the fences gone, and the fields silent again. But history rarely ends so neatly. What remained was a question that outlived the war itself and shaped how the world would remember it. History often remembers wars by their explosions, the roar of tanks, the clash of armies, the rise and fall of empires. But sometimes, the truest victories happen in silence. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in Texas, while Europe still burned, a handful of farmers opened their doors to their enemies. There were no speeches, no flags, no conditions, just a meal shared across the lines of war. In that small act, something extraordinary unfolded. It was not surrender, and it was not forgiveness. It was recognition that even when nations fall into madness, individuals can still choose decency. Those German women returned home with more than memories of captivity. They carried with them a living contradiction, that their fiercest adversaries had shown them kindness, that democracy could be gentle without being weak. And for many, that realization became the seed of a different Germany, one rebuilt not on obedience, but on conscience. For the Americans, too, it left a mark. The farmers who once feared the enemy discovered that the enemy could laugh, cry, and bow their heads in prayer before eating. The guards learned that trust could command more discipline than punishment ever could. Long after the fences rusted away, that lesson endured. That moral strength is measured not by how we fight our wars, but by how we treat those we have already defeated. The Second World War ended in triumph and tragedy, but its truest victory, the quiet one, took place not in Berlin or Tokyo, but in the sunlit fields of Texas. There, amid cotton and dust, strangers shared bread and proved that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can still find its voice.